Today we're going to cover our introduction to JavaScript, or at least we'll start it. And we'll be looking at JavaScript the remainder of the semester. That doesn't mean that you know everything about CSS or HTML. It just means that you know enough now where you should be able to figure out anything that we didn't cover. For HTML, on the HTML side, everything is a tag. So understanding how to put something on the page is simply understanding what tag to use and what attributes need to be used for that tag. For example, if you wanted to embed a video on your web page, there's tags for that. All right, so we didn't cover them in class, but if you Googled, for example, something like HTML tag video, you'll see an example of how to embed video. And there's an example. It's the video tag. You can set the height and weight. You can set whether there's controls or not. And you can supply potentially multiple different sources. The reason you do that is because one installation or another might support a different video format. So you can supply it in several optional video formats. Anyhow, I didn't want to cover the video tag, but there you go. The most important thing from this is, again, although we have not covered everything about HTML and CSS, you do have a fighting chance of being able to figure it out for yourself. With CSS, it's a matter of selector and attribute. The selector controls what on the page we want to set, and the attribute controls what about that thing we want to set. So do we want to change every link on the page? Do we want to change all the links of a certain class? Do we want to change the link that has a certain ID? All those are selectors. And then the attribute says what we want to change about it. Do we want to change the color? Do we want to change the font size? Or so on. So if you're not sure how to do something, for example, CSS rounded border, something we didn't cover, just Google it and you'll see how to get rounded corners. And it's simply an extra property, the border radius. All right, so we're going to cover JavaScript. And JavaScript is the third language that is used in web development. The first two languages, again, are HTML and CSS. And HTML is responsible for the content of the page. So HTML you use to have the text that's on the page, the links that are on the page, the images that are on the page, the video, the audio, and so on. So anything that consists of content is controlled by the HTML. You might have a paragraph of text, or you might have an image, or you might have a link. CSS controls the appearance of the page. What color is the font? What font are we using? How are the different things on the page positioned? And so on. All these things are the things that are controlled by CSS. Finally, we have our third language, JavaScript. And for the most part, JavaScript brings interactivity to the page. All right. It allows us to change the HTML or CSS of a page based on some action. And usually it's based on a user action. So for example, what's an example of this? Let's look at LC's page, home page. All right, this is our home page. If I put my mouse over that link, I see a submenu appear. All right. The user took an action, and the HTML or the CSS of the page was changed. An important thing to add to this is this happens without reloading the page. So notice when I put my mouse over that, it happens instantaneously. And we don't go to another page. We don't refresh the page. Notice when we refresh the page or when we go to the server to get the page again, the page flickers a little bit. This happens without changing, without reloading the page. So JavaScript is responsible for that. A typical way this is done, by the way, is the HTML for these submenus are loaded along with the rest of the page, but they're just set to be invisible. All right. And when you put your mouse over this, when the user takes that action, then they become visible. Now, there's advantages to doing things JavaScript, especially doing things like this that relate to the appearance of the page. If you remember back the old client-server diagram we had, oh, lovely. This is the transparent background. We can't see the lines. Let's look at it here. All right. Our clients are the people running the web browser. They can either be a laptop, a desktop, a mobile device. And there's other things too. It could be a gaming console. They go through the internet and connect to the server. They ask the server for a web page. The server sends back an HTML document. Now, if there's JavaScript code written that gets delivered along with the HTML and CSS on the client side, then if the client does something like puts their mouse over a link, that JavaScript can respond instantaneously to that action without having to go through the internet, asking the server for a revised page and getting it back. In computer terms, that whole trip through the internet to the server and back takes a lot of time compared to the speed at which code can run that has already been delivered to the browser. In addition, these small requests like displaying a submenu or hiding a submenu, you wouldn't want to bother the server with because the server is working on more critical things and you don't want to bog the server down with these very small requests. So again, when you load the page, what does the user get back? The user makes a request and they get delivered back HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Each of these being responsible for the things I said up here: the content of the page, the appearance of the page, and the interactivity of the page. Now I'm speaking in general terms about this. I don't mean every single example falls into this category, but most examples of JavaScript work like this. First thing that happens is the user takes an action. That might be to click on something. That might be to put their mouse on something. It might be to press a key. But the user takes some sort of action. For example, if we look at LC's page, there's a couple of actions we can take that trigger JavaScript. One of them, as we noted, is putting the mouse over this. When we put our mouse over one of these main links, a submenu appears. The other thing we could do is we could click on this little arrow and see the next slide in turn. Or we could just play the slideshow and have it show each slide for a certain amount of time. Those are two examples of things that happen on the client side. They happen without sending a request back to the server. They involve using JavaScript to change either the HTML or CSS of the page that has already been loaded. So when the page is loaded, we get all this HTML and CSS, even stuff that we don't see initially, along with the JavaScript to make things visible and invisible. So getting back to our formula for JavaScript, the user takes an action. We find the thing or things on the page we want to change. And then we use the JavaScript language, use other instructions in the JavaScript language to make that change. All right, we're going to go over a little bit smaller example of this. So if we looked at the code for LC's webpage, there's a whole lot of code on that page. And we don't want to sift through all that code. It would be better if we looked at a smaller example. So I have this example here. And let me show you a couple things it does. When the page loads, oh, so that's sort of fake Latin. So if you translate it, it gives you some nonsense text. All right, when we go and we click these buttons, we can make the text bigger or set it back to normal. The page is not reloaded. The JavaScript takes care of that. That's one thing that JavaScript is used for on this page. The second thing that JavaScript is used for is to, when we click these menus, we can make a submenu appears. Now, this is a little different than what LC does on its page. LC, all you have to do is hover the mouse over it. And we could change this to work that way as well. But the way we have it set up, you have to click the mouse to make the submenu appears. So let's look at each of these. All right, let's look at the code for each of these and sort of get a rough idea of how the very basics of JavaScript work. These examples, by the way, are posted in Canvas under the rest of the semester module. Can you believe it? We're in week 13, not much more time left in the semester. This page is called color.html. I don't know why it's called color.html. It really has nothing to do with color. I think this example sort of evolved over time. Let me edit it in Notepad. First thing we're going to look at are those two buttons. First of all, first thing to recognize is they are buttons and not submit buttons. All right? They're buttons because we do not want to send anything to the server. Remember from our discussion on forms that a submit button actually sends stuff to the server to be processed. Well, in this case, we don't want to send anything to the server to be processed. We just want some JavaScript to occur. So for invoking JavaScript, you use a button. All right. All right. Notice as part of that tag, inside the tag, there's an attribute of onClick. This is called an event. So the user takes action relates to an event. And what are examples of an event? OnClick, on mouse over, on mouse up or out rather, on key down, and so on down the line. In other words, this is saying when this happens, do something. When this button is clicked, do something. When I put my mouse over something on this page, do something. When I press a key when I'm in a field, do something. Some of you may use Twitter, for example, and it's been ages since I used Twitter, but if I'm not mistaken, on Twitter, every time you type in a letter, it shows you how many letters you have left. Because I think you get, what, 288 characters or 280 characters, something like that. Well, every time you press a character, it shows you that you have that many characters left. All right, that's an example of a key event. When you're in that text field or text area rather, as you press down the keys, the countdown goes down to show you how many characters you have left. We can look for a full list of these, and there's a bunch of them. We're going to cover a few of the common ones. So let's look for JavaScript events. They show an example, and then they show some of the common ones: on change, on click, on mouse over, on mouse out, on key down, on load. So it showed pretty much the same that I did. Let's see if we can get a list of all the events. That's something different. On submit is another one. On mouse over and out. Oh, here's a list. If you're offline, do something when you go offline. For example, you could put code in your page that if the user goes offline, if their connection to the internet goes away, then a warning message will go up and say, hey, you're no longer connected to the internet. We have 6 weeks to a musical mind. Excellent. Offline, on abort, on after print. So you can do something after the page was printed. Before the page is loaded, before it's printed. Blur, when you leave a field. When the media can play, in other words, when your video or audio file is able to be played. Can play all the way through without stopping for buffering. On change, on click, on context menu. So you see there's quite a few of these. Most of them relating to the user taking some action. We're going to focus again on these events that we've defined here, maybe a few others, because those by all means are the most common. So find a thing on the page that we want to change is the second thing. This involves what's called the DOM, or Document Object Model. What is a document object model? That relates to the way to refer to things on the page, the way to refer to the elements on the page. All right. For example, what if I wanted to change something about the section? How would I refer to it? Well, one way I could refer to it is say, let me see the section that has this as an ID. Now, remember what we've said about IDs. On a page, they have to be unique. In other words, if you have an ID of main for this section, there cannot be anything else on the page that has an ID of main. Otherwise, your JavaScript is not likely to work properly. For class, we can have a bunch of things on the page with the same class. In fact, we probably will. But for ID, we're only going to have one thing on the page with ID. We can also refer things by their tag. We can say, give me a list of all the links that are on the page. Give me a list of the footers that are on the page, which there should only be one of, and so on. So the document object model is the way that we refer to the pieces of the page. And oftentimes we're going to use this expression. Document, get element by ID. Now here's the thing about JavaScript. It is case sensitive. In other words, this needs to be just like this: lowercase d, lowercase g, capital E, capital B, capital ID. This is known as camel case because it's like kind of like a camel. The head of the camel is down, then each next word in the expression is capitalized. The first letter is capitalized. Document has to be a lowercase d, and so on. What this says is, give me the thing on the page that has an ID of main. What is that? Well, that's this section. So we're going to change something about that section. What are we going to change about it? What is the thing we're going to change about it? We're going to change its style. All right. Style is, if we're changing the style, we're changing the things that are set by CSS. One of the things that are set by CSS is the font size. So we're changing that. What are we changing it to? We're changing it to 2M. What does 2M mean? Is emphasized, is too emphasized. All right, read that. So it's twice as big as it normally should be. So if we're going to read this whole statement, we have something like this. in the document. On click equals. So that's saying when the user clicks on this thing. What thing? Well, whatever the on click is written on. The on click is part of the button. So whenever the user clicks on that button, what are we going to do? Between the double quotes, this is JavaScript statements that we're going to do. Notice when we use the double quotes to denote the beginning and end of the JavaScript statement, that means if we need quotes inside of the JavaScript statement, we need to use single quotes. So notice we use single quotes here and single quotes there. What are we changing? We're changing the thing on the page that has an ID of main. What are we changing about it? We're changing something about the style. What about the style? We're changing the font size. What are we setting it equal to? 2M. That's enclosed in quotes because that's not a JavaScript variable. That's something that we are just changing it to, the value. We're literally changing it to 2M. Now notice if you set the font size of something, if I wanted in CSS to set the font size of something, I would do this. # main. If I wanted to set the CSS for this down here, I would say font dash size. And then I would display it. So let me display it as, just for laughs, I'm going to change it to 1.25. I forgot the M. So notice it's a little bigger. All right. So notice the attribute in HTML that we're changing is font dash size. All right. What are we saying in the JavaScript though? We're saying font size. So there's a little discrepancy between how you refer to something in JavaScript and how do you refer to something in CSS. The general rule is when there's something that has a dash in CSS, you change it to be camel case. All right. Other than that, everything that you set in CSS, we can change in JavaScript. Our normal button, to put it back to normal then, sets the font size back to 1M. It's a little confusing when to keep things in quotes and when things are out of quotes. If you're hard coding an ID, in other words, your ID is not coming from a variable, you put the ID in quotes. That means look at main. Look at the thing that has an ID of main. If you have a specific value, that's going to be in quotes. But the expressions in the DOM are not in quotes. So with these two buttons, we can dynamically, in other words, we can dynamically set the font size to either be 2M or 1M simply by pressing the buttons back and forth. All right. Now, we can change other things about the page. Let's give it a background color. I'm going to give this originally a background color of what should we give it a background color of? Let's give it a background color of a darker gray. So that would be something like maybe, we'll make it 999999. That's not too dark of a gray. Let's change this back to 1M. I just changed that temporarily. Let's make a new button to change the color. On button, value equals, I'm going to say lighter gray. First part of the statement is going to be the same. Document. Find the thing on the page that has an ID of main. Set the style of it. What do we want to set the style of? Well, in CSS, we refer to it as background-color. Therefore, in JavaScript, we're going to refer to it as background color. It's part of the style, so it's part of the appearance. We're going to change the background color to a specific value. So I'm going to make it a lighter gray, which is $. CC. We can set it to lighter gray. It's already lighter gray, so it doesn't change it. Let's write the code to change it back. It's going to look identical to this button, except the value is going to be different. Point to the thing on the page that has an ID of main. Change something about the appearance. What about the appearance are we going to change? We're going to change the background color. What are we going to set it to? We're going to set it to back to the original color. So we can go back and forth. Now, what happens if something goes wrong? What if I don't, here I am, I've done this for a million years, so I know exactly what to type in. What if I do something wrong and I don't have something right? Well, depends on what you get wrong. If, for example, I got wrong, well, we'll take a look at if I get something in the instruction wrong. If I forgot that JavaScript is case sensitive and I put a capital D for document. Document get element by ID. Let's save it. Let's see what happens. First button still works. When I press the second one, doesn't do anything. All right. Now, when you're debugging something like this, when you're finding the problem with it, there's tools that you can use to help you try to figure out what's wrong. Generally speaking, what you don't want to do is just stare at the code and hoping that the problem jumps out at you. Now, in this case, the problem is pretty obvious, but we're going to pretend it wasn't so obvious. If I go to, this is in Google Chrome, but all the browsers have it. If I go to More Tools, Developer Tools, and I go to Console, it gives me an error message that may or may not be very descriptive. All right. There's sort of an art to reading these error messages. And the only way that you're going to really get used to it is by making a lot of errors, looking at them, and then figuring out what this means. Now, in this case, it says document.getElementById is not a function. And it tells us it's in line 39. Well, one thing is that one thing to keep in mind is it might not exactly be on line 39. That is where the browser noticed the error. The error could actually be a little bit before line 39. But anyhow, that's a good place to start looking at it. What's line 39? Okay, onClick equals document. It's telling me that this is not a function. Well, of course it's a function. I use it up here. Oh, wait a minute. That should be a lower D. And then when you do it, keep the console open. When I click on this, the console doesn't show any errors. Likewise, if I made this is a mistake I usually make, especially if I haven't done JavaScript in a while. Make ID, get element by ID, like that. It's going to give us a very similar kind of error that it did before when I click the button. Well, it does. That's not a function. Well, again, first thing to look at, if you're pretty sure you have the name of the function correct, is make sure it matches the case of what it's supposed to be. Now, what if I got main wrong? What if I accidentally spelled main with two N's, for example? This there is a little bit cryptic. Cannot read property style of null. Null is the way that is said in computer science. Null is a word that is used to indicate nothing. And nothing doesn't have any properties. The elements of the page have properties. What are the properties of the elements of the page? Well, there's the background color, there's the color of the text, there's the color of the border, there is the font size, there is the font face that's being used. All these things are attributes or properties of the element on the page. But it's telling me that you can't read the property style of nothing. Let's analyze what that means. What that's telling you is this expression points to nothing. All right. Why does it point to nothing? Document get element by ID is a valid function. All right. We're calling the right function, but we're pointing at the wrong thing, or we're trying to point at the wrong thing. The thing on the page is not called main with two ends. It's called main with one end. Therefore, this expression doesn't point to anything. And therefore, we're trying to change the style of that nothing. All right. And it's going to give us an error. JavaScript statements typically end with a semicolon. Let's see if it gives me an error if I don't have a semicolon. Actually, it forgave us. All right. Which is nice of it. It won't always do that. There will be times when it tells you that you need a semicolon. If you had, for example, a larger function. All right. What if we change it to some nonsense here? Doesn't do anything, but doesn't give us an error. All right. Well, that one's tricky to find. What that is telling you is this is valid. It found the thing on the page that we're referring to. It does have a style and a background color. It's just that this is an invalid value for color. So if you give it an invalid value for color, it'll try to do it. All right, but it's not going to give you what you expect or what you would hope for. You have to give it actually a valid color. Now, let's say, for example, here, we decide that when the page loads initially, it's kind of hard to read that text. It's pretty dark. It'd be nicer maybe if the text was white. So I'm going to go up here and I'm going to say color white. All right, so we load the page up. Yeah, that's easy to read. When we change it to a lighter gray, though, then we still have a problem. So I want to do two things when I click this button now. I want to change the text to black, and I want to change the background color to light gray. When I click this, I want to change it back to white. How would I do that? I do that by putting in an extra statement here. Wrong one. I don't want to change the background color. I just want to change the color. What do I want to change the color to? I want to change it to black. And in this case, what do I want to change the color to? I want to change the color to white. Click on this, makes it lighter gray and black. Click on this, it makes it darker gray and white. This, by the way, is a nice feature that you can do for accessibility purposes. remember, people with different eyesight or people with different color blindness, certain things work better for them. All right. So if you give someone a choice of what colors they want something to appear on the screen, that may be able to increase the readability of it. All right. Now let's say we wanted to maybe change the font when we click this button too. Well, at some point we'd have a whole bunch of statements in here and it would get really hard to read. So what we're going to do, and we'll talk about this next time in more detail, is we're going to put these instructions in what's called a function. And we're going to call that function, and instead of just one instruction at a time, we're going to call the function, and that function will do a bunch of instructions. Let me try here if I forget the semicolon, what happens. Oh, still doesn't care. Now, for your last assignment, other than the portfolio and the project, we're going to go over several of these examples over the next 2 or 3 weeks. Well, including this week, 2 or 3 weeks. So next week and maybe the week after that, we're going to go over some JavaScript examples. They are all in a folder called, in Canvas, called JavaScript examples in the rest of the semester module. This is the example that we had today. We have the example of a menu that when you put the mouse over, it shows a menu, but it doesn't hide it again when you take the mouse out. All right. This example sort of builds. Second version of this that we have, when we click on it, we see the menu. And the third version we have displays it and then hides it when we take our mouse out of it. So that's more like the LC example. Now notice how the HTML and the CSS and all that work together. The HTML is the content. When this page is loaded, we get all of the menus, including the submenu. We just make them visible and invisible and change some attributes of them via JavaScript. They're also laid out to be next to each other like this. Another example that we have is the zoo example. We have 2 slightly different versions of this. This allows me to put my mouse over a thumbnail and get the larger image. I'm sure you've all seen photo galleries like that. This one, we have to actually click on the image to change it. Either of them could be effective depending on what you want. Our final example is the forms example, where we've taken our search page and added validation. So if we enter nothing in, it gives us an error. If we enter something in, it goes out and does the Google search. The last example that we have is calc.html, where you can put in a value and calculate the circumference. We'll do as many of these as time allows, but I would encourage you to look through all these, look through all the examples in JavaScript this week, if possible, and study them and sort of start to get an idea of how this works. And bring your questions to class or email me the questions, And we'll be able to go through those in more detail, as many of them as we can over the next few weeks. Are there any questions? All right, that's all I had for today. Have a great week.